Hi, everyone. Welcome to Democracy, Pandemic, and How We Move Forward, a panel discussion that's a part of our virtual International Festival of Arts and Ideas. My name is Elizabeth Nearing. I'm the curator of Ideas Programming. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, in the land we call home, Connecticut. We hope that wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you are on and the history of the place you are in. You can find out more about a Native land near you, and we'll put a link in the comments for you to check it out. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas stands with Black Lives Matter and with the countless citizens in our own city and across the country who are exercising their right to protest the systemic racism at the root of police violence. The festival stands in solidarity with Black and Brown communities who are targeted and abused by unjust systems of oppression. And this year, our Ideas programming has been created with the theme Democracy, We the People, and talking a lot about people power. And this amazing group of panelists is going to dive into what that looks like right now amidst the pandemic and how we look forward. We've had the great privilege of collaborating with our neighbors throughout this process, and we want to collaborate with you even throughout this discussion. So please, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can write your questions and thoughts in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to as much of them as we can throughout. And so I want to thank you for joining us on this journey. This panel is also brought to you in partnership with the Connecticut Humanities and major support from the Whitney Center and media support from Connecticut Public. This panel in particular is in partnership with the Ash Center. And we've worked really closely with our moderator and host tonight, Miles Rapoport, as we've been talking about what to talk about with democracy. And Miles Rapoport is currently the Senior Practice Center in American Democracy at the Ash Center of the Harvard Kennedy School. He's lived in Connecticut for 40 years and is married and raised 2 sons in West Hartford and still lives there. He served for 10 years in the Connecticut legislature and 4 years as Secretary of the State, and has been a democracy advocate and organizational leader, serving as president of Demos and of Common Cause. He still serves on the board of Demos, the American Prospect magazine, and the Connecticut-based Everyday Democracy. And without any further ado, here's Miles Rapoport.
Hi, Liz, thank you very much. And I want to thank the organizers of the festival for creatively adapting to the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I think we're in a really remarkable moment, as we all know. I also really want to thank the panelists, who I don't think of as panelists. I think of them more as colleagues. We have known each other and worked together over years and have a lot more work to do together. I also want to thank the festival for standing in solidarity with the people who are protesting both against the murder of George Floyd and also the racism and violence that underlies it. So thank you for helping to pivot us in that direction. So the last 2 weeks, it seems to me, have been a painful reminder in this moment of the tenacity and power of racism in our society, and also a hopeful moment of activism and change. On the one hand, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police, the casual use of brute force, and the stunning disregard of Black lives that act represented, in the words of my friend and former Congresswoman Donna Edwards, were sickeningly familiar. 52 years after the Kerner Commission sounded the alarm about racism and inequality, it seemed for a moment as though little had changed. And yet the moment is also, it seems to me, showing us that a lot has changed. The massive multiracial and multi-generational protests that we've seen, and in a way even more so, the polls showing that these protests are popular, they're supported, and the response of the Trump administration is not at all, is really remarkable. And that's a lot to build on, it seems to me. It also builds, I think we also have a lot to build on in the high levels of engagement and activism that we've seen evident on so many issues, so many new and vibrant organizations that have been created, and we will list organizations that you can contact with and help with activism as we go along in this panel. We've also seen, the activism was also seen in the 2018 midterms, in which the turnout was 40% higher than the 2014 midterms. And that level of engagement and civic engagement shows no signs in my mind of abating. All right, so here we are, and two other things that we happen to be in the middle of one is the worst pandemic in 100 years, one that has hit our economy and our lives, especially those of poor people and communities of color, like an earthquake, and will actually change the way we live for a very, very long time to come. And I shouldn't forget, I suppose, that we are exactly 5 months from yesterday from the national election that is either, people are describing it as either the most consequential of our lifetime or the most consequential in decades. And of course, the difference is just how many years you've lived. This is, 1968 was close in my book, and I was there. So anyway, but the fork in the road that our country will take in November, like the pandemic, will shape our future and of our lives as well. So the question of how American democracy is faring at this moment in the pandemic and in this moment in history couldn't be more timely. Fortunately for us, we have an amazing group of people who are dedicating their lives to improving our democracy and bringing about justice. Let me have the pleasure of introducing them. First, Heather McGhee.
They made cakes yet.
Oh boy. Hi.
Hi, everybody.
1 second.
Anyway, let me talk about Heather McGhee a little bit. I worked with Heather for 10 years at Demos after she joined the organization right after graduating from Yale University. At Demos, she was an incredible thinker and advocate, and also a superb organizational leader. She was the obvious choice to succeed me after 13 years at the helm of Demos, and she took the organization to new and remarkable heights. Today, she is still a distinguished senior fellow at Demos. She is the co-chair of the board of the Color of Change, the largest online racial justice organization. She's the author of the forthcoming book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. A little advertisement, the book is now available for pre-order and will be on bookshelves early next year. And while I'm at it, Heather recently gave a terrific TED Talk. Racism has a cost for everyone. Almost 1 million people have viewed it since March 1st, and I suggest that everybody who's watching this program, the minute you're done, go watch Heather's TED Talk. You won't regret it. Second panelist is María Teresa Kumar. María Teresa is a familiar face, but more importantly, a powerful voice to many of you. María is an Emmy Award nominated analyst and contributor with NBC and MSNBC. She is the founding CEO and president of Voto Latino, the largest Latinx voter registration and advocacy organization, reaching 8.5 million people per month. And she just was telling us before the broadcast that in the first 4 days of June, they have registered 130,000 people, more than their entire budget, they call it, I don't know why, per month. And in the last 72 hours have registered 21,000 new people. So we're talking about a powerhouse here. María Teresa is also on the board of Emily's List, the World Economic Forum Global Shapers, and the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. I met María Teresa in 2012, as did Heather, because María Teresa and Voto Latino were the recipient of the Demos Transforming America Award. Her work then was inspiring, and that continues to be the case today. Lastly, Professor Archon Fung. Archon is the Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also the director of the Democracy Program at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School. That is where he and I both work, and we're very proud of the Ash Center's work on democratic governance and a really robust democracy program. Also a real leader in government innovation, putting out the Harvard Kennedy School's Innovation in Government Awards every year. And there's a very big Asia program in part of it. So Ash Center is one of the most vibrant centers at the Kennedy School. Archon is the reason I'm there, and I'm delighted to work with him. He's also written 5 books and edited a bunch more with titles like Full Disclosure, Empowered Participation, and Deepening Democracy. Do we see a pattern in these titles at all? I will say that Archon has been a remarkable leader in the field of citizen participation and deliberative democracy. In fact, he and I met as board members of Everyday Democracy, a wonderful democracy organization based in Hartford. In January of 2017, he brought me in as a fellow at the Ash Center, and I have been grateful and privileged to have him as a colleague and kind of a boss. Anyway, let me tell you what the format is. We're not having speeches or opening statements. What I have is a set of 3 questions that I'm going to pose to the panelists. We'll do the first 2, roughly speaking, 5-minute answers, and they're going to be cued about the timing. And then we'll open up to questions. So if you have questions, please just go to the comment section and ask them, and they'll be filtered into us. And then the third question will also serve as a final statement. So there we have it. We have 90 minutes minus a few. So let's go to it. So question 1 is a 2-parter. And it goes like this. At this moment of multifaceted challenge to American democracy, what do you see as the biggest challenge? What worries you the most? And the second part of the question is, what gives you the most hope? So we're going to start off with Heather. Heather, your work today centers on the critical issue of race, and your book is about that. And how would you address this question?
Thank you so much, Miles. First of all, I just want to apologize for that alarm and hope that it doesn't go off again. I am really pleased to be virtually back in Connecticut, where I spent my college years, and so honored to be with you, Archon, and you, Maria, Teresa, and of course, Miles, who was my first boss, actual boss, when I started working at Demos when I was just 22 years old, and mentored me and believed in me. Showed me the ropes of the nonprofit advocacy world and how to fundraise and how to build coalitions and how to win and how to make change for the demos, the people of a nation, and then believed in me enough to hand the reins over to me when I was just 33 years old. And it's been a wonderful ride together, Miles. So thank you. And thanks to the organizers of the festival, and also, of course, to the Ash Center. So, I in running and working at Demos for so long, I grew to understand democracy in a very full way, both the systems that allow citizens to have their voice be heard through voting and lobbying and activism, but also the first part of the word democracy, which means our demos, which is not just cabined to legal citizenship, which is not at all, in fact, predicated on one's ability or likelihood to vote, but is really a word that stands for the people of a nation, and in my interpretation, what connects the people of a nation. And in our multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-origin demos, the health of our demos is not strong right now. So when Miles asks me, what gives me hope about our democracy and what I think are the challenges of our democracy, I'll start with the challenges. We have been at a time of widening economic inequality, where the gains of the labor of the people of this country are going to a very, very narrow band at the top, where in example after example, there's very little accountability for those in power and close to power, whether you're talking about Wall Street or Donald Trump and his attempts to collude to circumvent the election and degrade our election process, or you're just talking about, people in the businesses that we run, or the institutions and colleges, where we just see so often that if you have a lot of power, there's very little accountability. And on the flip side, there's too much accountability, too much punishment, too little benefit of the doubt to people who are ordinary working and middle class people, particularly if they are people of color, particularly if they are trans people, gender non-conforming, or if they have any kind of previous experience with the criminal justice system. And on top of that, we also see where the health of our discourse with the attacks from the right wing on the fourth estate and on the media, the information apocalypse that I am very worried that we are hurtling towards, where there is just so much incentive to create conspiracy theories and to degrade any sense of common truth, facts, or science. And of course, the fact that, as Republican general said today in the newspaper, Donald Trump, the president of the United States right now, has made it his job to divide the nation. So those are all the reasons why I feel like we have challenges in the health of our demos. That said, I just got back from my most recent turn in the streets, where I am right now. And in the streets, the health of our demos is sound. The health of our demos is beautiful. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Hold on.
Emergencia.
We'll wait for you, Heather.
I love that it's in Spanish.
Prisiona para silenciar.
Is it okay?
I think we're good. I have sent a
I want
message.
to know where you are, Heather, in Mehencia.
I'm writing from a bunker in Latin America.
I hope that's true. Oh, God.
Anyway, I'm at somebody else's apartment.
Oh, enjoy, sorry.
Focus and work without my toddler. And so I've texted them to say, what's going on? Okay. So the health of the demos is really strong in the streets. You have seen a fundamentally unprecedented outpouring of millions of Americans taking action in the streets, in their homes, online, but really in the streets in the face of brutal state repression. With the 40 plus curfews around the country that have given the police free license to use tear gas, rubber bullets, and flashbangs against citizens and residents exercising their constitutional rights to protest. And still, the protests are growing. And I have seen people of all walks of life just say that this isn't enough is enough moment. And that is the single most inspiring thing I have seen in my 40 years on this planet. And so in that way, I do believe that we represent a new America that is coming. And we have a vision of a sense of equality and solidarity and fairness and justice that is out of line with the power structure right now, but it is absolutely in the hearts of so many people. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Maria Teresa, how would you address this question?
No, I think that what we have, first of all, Miles, I want to thank you. Not only did you pivot, but we are having perhaps one of the most timely conversations that we can have at this moment. And so thank you for inviting me to the conversation. I've been a long fan of yours, as you know. Anything that Miles asks me to do, I will blindly say yes. I don't know if that's good or bad, Miles. But thank you. And it's wonderful to see Archon. I know that we've been on panels on occasion over at Harvard and my alma mater. I have to say thank you. And Heather, I am just always in awe of what you've done. We first met with Campus Progress, if we remember. That was one of our first conversations. We won't date that, but we know each other now double digits. And keep going, sister. Keep telling the truth. So, this is we're living a really unique moment. I think that what COVID has done in the last 50 days is broken open these social inequities that Martin Luther King was marching about 50 years ago. And it's broken open the wounds that our country has, and it also the opportunities that we have. The health and the wealth of a generation of young people has never been more precarious, and these fall disproportionately on communities of color. And the fact that we have deemed what an essential worker is, but at the same time are fine with certain essential workers exposing themselves every single day, while some of us can shelter in place, exposes also the inequality. Not all of us are being asked to sacrifice equally during this pandemic, yet we see people coming out in force when we see brutality. And one of the things that I deeply believe in is that we as a country have to come together and use this moment as a new FDR, New Deal moment to address these systemic changes. There's not one individual in America that can stare at you and say that they have not been touched either by the pandemic or moved by what is happening in the streets. And the only way we make those changes is by will. Oftentimes we hear people say that things are too expensive to address societal injustices, but we have right now a Congress that is minting money to address short-term changes. What about long-term changes? 20% of those of Latinx workers, for example, have been left out of the CARES Act, either because they are undocumented or are an American citizen living with an undocumented. That's unjust. These individuals pay close to $27 billion in our state and federal taxes. How do we make sure we bring them into our community when we depend so much on their work and their labor? I think one of the challenges, though, is that we have to continue having these honest conversations that things are not okay, that the system is failing many of us, and we have to be bold in our vision. One of the things that I often remind people is that in the 1960s, during turmoil, we had a president that one day looked up in the moon and said, let's go there. And with technology, Miles and team, less than our cell phones, we did it. So when someone says that some of this stuff is insurmountable, it's all a matter, in my deep held belief is it's a matter of will. When you ask me what gives me hope is that in the 2018 election, we had the most individuals participate in our electoral booths in 100 years. And for the very first time, Generation X, Y, and Z overtook the voting booth than the older population. The reason that's important is that we ushered in the most diverse Congress in our nation's history, the most women, the most people of color, the most LGBTQ, the most veterans, the most mix of who we are as a country. And when people ask you, why does diversity matter? We now have a portfolio of over 400 pieces of legislation that speak to the truth that we want to abide by. We want to modernize our elections and secure the vote. We want to make sure that we have background checks for individuals after 25 years trying to push that legislation. We want to provide a pathway for dreamers. We want to make sure that we're greening our economy and that we're addressing climate change, and the list goes on. The only obstacle right now is that we haven't finished our business. We have to make sure that we mobilize in November. One of the things that I will be honest, was giving me pause was that we were getting too comfortable again, because what led to that massive change in 2018 is that the day that Donald Trump took office, the next day we marched. And we marched practically every single weekend leading up to that election to expose what he was about. This, George Floyd, has perhaps given us a renaissance of our civic duty and the demands that are placed upon each of us to make sure that his death was not in vain. We all witnessed it. We cannot look in vain. And so what gives me hope is that we're seeing so many people, so many Americans coming together in unity to demand justice in the face of police brutality. And I think that is our pathway. We have to continue participating. At Voto Latino, Miles, as you shared, we had expected to register roughly 22,000 in the month of June. We did that yesterday. We have surpassed our goals already, and we need to continue investing. And 90% of the people that we registered were under the age of 33, 79% of women, and close to 70% of them were people of color. We're paying attention. We recognize that we have to continue asking for radicalization at the voting booth, because otherwise the systems don't change. So that's what gives me hope.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Archon, how about you?
Great. Thank you very much, Miles.
Among us. You have to be a big thinker here.
I'll do my best. Thank you very much, Miles, and folks who've organized this incredibly stimulating Festival of the Arts. And it's just an incredible honor to be able to speak with you tonight and to join Heather and Maria Teresa, who are doing unbelievable, hard and good and extremely important work. Democracy faces many, many challenges, and I'll pick just one, and it really echoes what Heather and Maria Teresa have said. I think inequality is the biggest challenge to democracy. And almost since there's been democracy at all, since democracy has been an idea in the world, people have recognized that economic inequality poses a huge challenge. In the 18th century, Rousseau said that democracy requires a society in which no one is so rich as to be able to buy another, and no one so poor as to have to sell himself. And I think we're well beyond that boundary right now. In the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, Louis Brandeis, later Supreme Court Justice, said, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great concentrated wealth in the hands of the few. but we cannot have both. Inequality in America, as a lot of people in the audience I'm sure know, has reached levels far higher, as high as any time since the Gilded Age. This inequality has been building for a long time. This is not a Trump presidency problem. It's been building since the 1970s. And I just want to highlight 3 problems that inequality brings. One is that it gives people really different amounts of influence over public policy. So, voting, anyone can vote, but we know that people with more money and more income and more education vote more than people with less money and income and education. So that's the first level of inequality. The second level of inequality is who gets to give to political campaigns and politicians, right? And that's the money level, which is far greater in terms of inequality than the voting level, right? And people talk a lot about the money level, but there's a third level, and that's the level of groups and who gets to organize. And we think of organizations like the one that you founded and Heather ran and Maria Teresa runs as people's organizations, the political organizations. But there are a lot of other political organizations that I think are more influential and more powerful. So a couple of political scientists surveyed all of the organizations in Washington, D.C. to figure out who they represented. And they found that 90% of the lobby groups in Washington, D.C. represent executives and professionals, which are about 20% of the American workforce. And that means the bottom 80%, people with blue-collar jobs, people who work in shops and restaurants, people who drive Uber, they get 10% of the groups, the lobby groups in Washington. So to my mind, that's the biggest level of political inequality, is who gets a group and how powerful those groups are.
Miles?
Hey. And then the second level of inequality is agenda control, is what we can talk about. And I'll just put it really crudely. The role of money in politics really limits what's sayable. And so to put it crudely, if you're a presidential candidate in the modern era, you can say things that are in between what the leftmost billionaire believes and the rightmost billionaire believes, right? And that's kind of the limit of what you can say. And Americans have far greater variety of views and political preferences out there than between the leftmost billionaire and the rightmost billionaire. So that's the second problem of inequality. The third problem of inequality is really unresponsive government. A couple of really great political scientists, Marty Gillens and Ben Page, looked at how responsive government is to what people want. And so they looked over decades, and they looked at all of the legislation that Congress passes and all of the public opinion polls. And for issues on which better off people have different views than less well-off people, they found that government has been responsive. Congress has been responsive to the top 10% of the income distribution and not at all responsive to anyone else. So on that measure of responsiveness, you've got a pretty good democracy if you're in the top 10% of the income distribution. But if you're not in the top 10% of the income distribution, the democracy is not working very well for you, in the sense that government is not really passing laws that you want when people who are better off than you want different things. The reasons for hope, I do have hope out there. I think we're beginning to see things open up and things bust out of the consensus of the leftmost billionaire and the rightmost billionaire. And it seems like ages ago, but I thought the Democratic primary season was really exciting from a small d Democratic perspective, because you saw people offering a range of ideas that have just been off of the table for the last 30 years. You had everything from a universal basic income to proposals for corporate boards to have seats for labor representatives to Medicare for all, right? Any one of those ideas that I've just mentioned, if you'd have walked into a room in the West Wing during the Obama administration and proposed that idea, I think first they would have snickered a little, and then they would have laughed, and then they would have taken your pass and escorted you out of the White House. And that was in an Obama administration, right? And so that gives me hope that the politics are opening up. That's one thing that gives me hope. And then the second thing that gives me hope is that people are developing political innovations that really work. And I really, whatever you think of Senator Sanders when he was campaigning for president, whatever you think of his policies, I think his business model of how to run a campaign was revolutionary and will have long-lasting effects. The fact that he was dependent on small donor donations and no billionaires meant that he could say stuff that billionaires didn't like. And that was, that's quite an innovation in American presidential politics. And that's the important innovation. The current protests, the mobilization that you've talked about and other people have talked about over just the last week and a half are heartening to me because I believe that many people are out there not only because of the murder of George Floyd or even because of police killings of Black men, but because they view those things as a broader pattern of racism and inequality and lack of democracy. And they're out there for those reasons too, right? And so that's extremely heartening. And why don't I leave it at that? I think those are a couple reasons for hope.
Great. All wonderful answers. Thank you very, very much. So for question number 2, I want to actually get a little more short term and think about the upcoming election. In exactly 5 months, as I said, from yesterday, we'll have that momentous election that I talked about. I'm not asking you a horse race question, but I want to look at the process itself. How confident are you that we will have a fully participatory election and a fair and trusted result? There's been a lot of conversation about all this, but that's the kind of election we want, with full participation, a fair and trusted result, and what needs to happen to give us the best chance to achieve it. Maria Teresa, you and Voto Latino are absolutely on the front lines of this very question. What are you seeing on this front?
Yeah, no, Miles. I think that this is one of the biggest challenges because I think that everybody on the panel would agree that this is going to be one of the most monumental elections of our lifetime. It will set the direction of our country, not for 4 years, but I would say for the next 20. And in that, we have to make sure that we're diligent because we're in the middle of a COVID pandemic, where the health of participation is a big deal, but then we're also in the middle of a presidency who has demonstrated that he will use every tool at his disposal to cause serious intimidation. And I say this not lightly, but I think that the day of what we have witnessed in the past couple of days from this administration should put all of us on notice. A democracy is just as healthy as our awareness and our participation and our diligence, and we must be diligent. Voto Latino, full disclosure, we are leading a coalition along with the NAACP and AFT on protecting the vote, creating actions at the senatorial level, at the congressional level, to ensure that we have the funding adequate that states need in order to make sure that we are protecting that vote. And it's basically $30.7 billion to ensure that every single state has the infrastructure that we need and that every single state is basically playing by the same rules. A big concern for us was what happened in Wisconsin, when voting became not only so politicized that we had one party that was willing to put the health of their voters at risk and did not postpone an election day. And as a result, sadly, we saw people in Wisconsin exercise their right to vote, stand in line, and over 50 people got ill with COVID. And sadly, some have lost their lives as a result. That is malpractice. That is government malpractice because we actually know how to do elections properly. And so in the work that we're doing, we're also advocating that every state plays by the same rules. We work very closely with Mark Elias, and we have actually filed our own federal lawsuit against the state of Texas because in Texas, they only allow mail-in ballots if you're 65 years or older. That is, and has declared that having COVID or being exposed to COVID is not a health crisis enough to receive a vote by mail. That is a form of voter suppression, and we won't go into the nuances of all of that, but for the folks that are tuning in, we are basically asking that everybody plays by uniform rules, and we're really requesting 4 things. One is that vote by mail should be free, postage free, or prepaid by the government so that every American has the option. It shouldn't be either or, but because we want people to have the option to be able to vote by mail, but that shouldn't be the only choice. We want to make sure that people throw out signature matches, because let's be honest, I sign my signature differently depending on how fast I am, right? So how speed I am. Most of us do. We also want to make sure that in communities of colors in particular, and in Native American communities, oftentimes we rely on local organizations to physically pick up those ballots. We should allow those to make sure that that happens, so that there's that safety of the vote. And then the last one, but not the least one, we want to make sure that postmark dates are recognized as the time that someone cast a ballot. We right now at Voto Latino are in a contested lawsuit with Arizona, because I can live in Yuma County, drop my vote in the mail in Yuma County, but then my mail is actually processed in Phoenix. And so if the county election does not receive my postmark even on Tuesday of election day, even though I filed it a week ago, they won't count it. They will throw it out. So we want to make sure fundamentally that people play by these 4 basic rules, and we have to inform our voters, because we also recognize that there's plenty of misinformation out there, and we have to make sure that, particularly in communities of color and immigrant communities and African American communities, where these tactics of including vote by mail have been used for suppression, that we have to make sure that they're aware of what their rights are. And we can go on, but those are just the 4.
Maria Teresa, before we go, do you mind, Miles, if I say, can you tell people how to take action in support of that agenda?
Yes, they could actually text protect our vote to 73179, and we'll be able to provide them much more information. And I believe there is a website, and I will get that to you guys by the end. So they could also provide. Thank you. And Heather helped shepherd a lot of this, herding all the cats to make sure that we have a coalition. So it was a coalition of 89 strong, and we're still going at it.
That's great.
All right, wonderful, and very clear and very concise. And I'll add a little bit and say that one of the things that has given me hope over the last years is I really do feel like there has been a very robust pushback against all of the various forms of voter suppression, whether that has been in the form of litigation, legislation, ballot initiatives. I think that there have been lots and lots of efforts at suppressing and discouraging voting that really have been pushed back successfully. And that is one of the things that has given me hope over the last years. I'm sorry, Archon, you're next.
Oh, great. Thank you. So on the question is, how confident are you that we'll have a fair and trusted result? I don't have a huge amount of confidence that we'll have a fair and trusted result. I wish I had a lot more. I guess I'm really quite concerned that when we wake up on that Wednesday in November, we won't really know who the president is, or there will be a fair amount of disagreement about who the president is. And you can imagine all sorts of nightmare scenarios that would result in that. I think part of mostly the reason for that is that political sides are really divided against one another right now, so much that different people in America have very different ideas about what would count as fair and who should be trusted. And one huge challenge, and you may feel it yourself as you're kind of listening to this conversation, is that many people are so divided and so fearful about their opponent winning that it feels more important to win in politics, especially in November, than it is to have the integrity of the electoral process itself hold together. Here's what I mean. For democracy to work, most people, most of the time, have to believe that the rules of the game are fair and inclusive, and accept that at least, half of the time they'll be on the losing side. And they have to value the process of democracy more highly than winning, right? If for enough people in America, winning power is more important than maintaining and playing by the rules, then people start to bend the rules and ignore them and break them. And then politics isn't a democracy anymore. It's just a power grab. It's a free-for-all. And I think we're getting close to that. And I don't quite know what to do to try to shore it up so that we have more confidence and allegiance to the process. The problem is really visible in some Republican national political leadership when Mitch McConnell says that measures to expand the number of voters in America is a Democrat power grab. What I hear is he's arguing that it's okay for politicians to use policy to shape the electorate so that they have better chances of winning. I mean, I think that's horrible. I disagree with that. Every American should vote, and the role of politician is to win their vote, is to convince the most Americans to support them. In a democracy, people pick the politicians. Politicians don't get to pick the electorate, right? That's not a democracy. That's something else. But I think this problem thinking that winning is more important than the process is also present on the left. I know some people who think that a second Trump term would spell the end of American democracy. So, play out this thought experiment. Imagine that the 2020 election is deeply divided, that it ends up looking like an electoral college tie the way that it did in the 2000 election. And then the Supreme Court resolves the tie in favor of a second Trump presidency, right? I think many Democrats might consider that electoral result illegitimate because they don't like the court's reasoning, or they think that the court is biased in favor of Republicans, is too politicized. They think the popular vote should decide it, all kinds of reasons. But a lot of people, I think would regard that result as illegitimate. But right now, with all of its flaws, the Electoral College, and in this scenario, the Supreme Court, are what the rules of the game say, right? So I think I'm going to offer a controversial thought here, wrap it up by what we need to do to try to make the election more fair and trusted. Three things that some of which echo Maria Teresa. One is that you should, out there when you're talking to your friends and family between now and November, just really try to solidify the idea that all eligible Americans should vote. And that's what our democracy requires. And that anyone who says otherwise is putting their own political self-interest above American democracy. Second, try to convince everyone that you talk to that in order for all Americans to vote and have the opportunity to vote, we need two things. We need great in-person voting everywhere that is safe in the era of COVID. And we need great universally accessible vote by mail everywhere that's paid for, right? Let's work toward that, and we have to work quickly. The third point, I think, is the one that some people in who are on the more progressive side of the spectrum might find a little bit, might object to. I think number three, we just all need to agree that the Electoral College winner is the President of the United States, not the popular vote winner. Those are the rules that we have. I don't particularly like those rules. I don't like the existence of the Electoral College, but until we change them, all Americans should respect the rules of the game now, even as we work to change them on the left. Again, this might be, or work to change them in the future. Again, this might be a little bit of a tough pill for some people, but that's what I think.
Thanks, Archon. Before I go to Heather, let me just remind people in the audience that if you have a question, please put it in the comment section, and the organizers behind this and technicians behind the scene will flip them to us. I have a few in my pocket if I need them, but I would love to have some from you. Heather, what do you see on looking at the election ahead to the election?
Yeah, briefly, because I think Archon and Maria Teresa's comments have been really wonderful. And if people want to know more about the intricacies of vote by mail and how to make it really fair and equitable, there's a report on Demos's website at demos.org about that topic. So in terms of, really the question of what's going to happen when we wake up the day after the election, given that it is likely to be an extremely close election, and given that we are likely to have long lines because we are likely to not have enough poll workers, and a big voter suppression tactic of the past few years has been to cut down on polling stations, particularly in communities of color, and given social distancing, and we're not going to know. We are not going to know the next morning. And so I think, and absentee ballots, which I meant to say, of course, is one of the most important reasons why it's good that we don't know, because we really will need to count all of those ballots, or mail-in ballots, as we'll call them now. So I think this gives us a very interesting quandary, because we are so used to seeing Steve Kornacki and everybody on CNN, just sort of up there saying, we've projected it with 2% of the vote, and that's just, we are not going to have a fast food return on the election. And there are going to be people like us flooding the zone, trying to talk about what we're seeing, trying to shape the narrative. There will be disinformation online, and we will just have to wait. And I really think that that's something we should just sort of acculturate ourselves to now. But I also, because I'm on TV and people, think of me as sort of a, political strategist who's somewhere in the rooms with some people who know something, oftentimes I get stopped on the street and people, look me in the eye and they say with a desperation, what is going to happen? And I say to them always, whatever you make happen. Because we cannot armchair pontificate about how elections are going to turn out, about how much voter turnout there'll be, about how much engagement there will be. The only way this democracy works is if it becomes as popular as brunch to register voters, to go out and knock on doors, to text your friends to say, are you voting, to donate, to talk about the election, to be a capital C citizen, even if you don't actually have the right to vote for various reasons. You live here, you're subject to its rules, you can participate in so many ways. So, this volunteerism, this activism, this civic participation that we have seen really since Trump took the oath of office is just, it has to be the new normal. And we cannot, for the health of our democracy, for the health of our society, for the lives of our people, we simply cannot sit back and ask what's going to happen. We have to make whatever we want happen. That's part of being in a democracy.
Great. Thank you very much. Those are great answers. And I've got my fingers crossed on and my legs in action too. I'll say that. Okay, we have a question, which is someone asked about the idea of starting a freedom school for the 21st century, or a democracy 101. So how can we, I guess I take that to mean, how can we elevate the teaching of democracy, I would say both to young people and to the citizens at large, as we go forward from here? Anybody want to take a little crack at that?
I think, at a very basic level, Miles and team, is that we have to introduce civic education back into the classroom. It seems obscene, but only 8 out of 50 states require civic education to graduate from high school. 8 out of 50 states. When 51% of the children right now in K through 12 are kids of color, many of them who are first generation, where are they learning democracy building? I was fortunate enough to come to this country when I was 4 years old. And even back then, to date myself a lot, there was only 4 channels or 3 channels plus PBS. So I was indoctrinated not only in school, but I was indoctrinated through Looney Tunes. I learned about property rights, gun rights, and go down the thing, because we were all watching, consuming the same information. And it was reinforced by what I was being taught in school with my media consumption. That is not the case. And so when people ask, what should we do? We should demand that our state legislators reintroduce civic education. Texas is one of the largest school systems in the country. And as a result, Texas dictates much of what goes into our students' school curriculum. That is the same Texas that wanted to say that slavery was immigration, and they wanted to erase Cesar Chavez from the history books. That not knowing our history also prevents us from recognizing the roots of where we're coming from and why we have this struggle today. So for the folks that are following, I would encourage you to talk to your state legislators and make sure that there is a curriculum. And if anybody's tuning in from Texas, you guys are part of a larger piece of this pie.
Okay. Archon, Heather, you want to add in here at all?
I think it's a wonderful idea. I'll note that the actual freedom schools, the Children Defense Fund's freedom schools in the South, are actually still going and actually are bigger than they have been in a long time. I do think that, we get so much political information and civic information online, but there is something profound about the actual experience of, being taught and learning in groups. By someone who cares, which is very different than someone who wants you to like their post. So I love that idea. And then someone asked, and I feel like because I just talked about this, I should say, a really important question, which is, if I think I can go in and vote, right? Because I've gone into the grocery store, I've gone into, fill up my car with gas. is there a reason why I should do mail-in voting instead? I think that's a really, it's a very personal question, but for me, I would just say that, there is something very, I would like to go in and pull the lever if I could. And I think a lot of people of color feel that way. There's not a lot of trust of, I'm just going to put this in. I remember the first time I ever got an absentee ballot, it's because I was going to be in the hospital giving birth. And I got my envelope and I was so excited and I brought it with me in my go bag and I opened it up and there was no ballot inside. And I was just like, unfortunately, our governments are very stressed, very under-resourced. We can support them. We can help them. Organizations like ours are doing that, helping them, get best practices. But there is not a reason why you should necessarily prefer mail-in voting to in-person voting, in my opinion.
Right. I want to go back and make a little bit of a comment on the question of how do we do education for civic participation. One idea that has been, circulated for a long time is the idea of universal national service. One of the ways in which people get educated is to be with people who do not come from the exact same socioeconomic or racial status that they come from. One of the ways that people are learn about being part of a demos, is by being in situations in which they are required to work with other people. So I think part of the FDR agenda that ought to be resurrected, if we go back, was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which could be a national health corps in our current situation, but something where for a year or 2 years after people graduate from high school, they give something to the nation and also take from it the ability to be a real participant. So I'll throw that into Joe Biden's mix of things that he has to do when and if he gets there.
Yeah, I agree with that. Until we get the funding for universal national service, which I think would be a great idea. I think civic education is fantastic. I like the kinds of civic education that are more hands-on, asking people in schools in high school or middle school to actually pick some problem in their community and work on it and learn what real kind of politics and public problem solving looks like by doing it. And then on the more civic side, rather than the education side, I think that every high school student that registering to vote and voting if you're 18 by the time you graduate, or pre-registering, should be a rite of passage as just what we do. I think we've lost somewhat the civic commitment, the idea that everyone should just vote because it's part of your responsibility.
Okay. Another question that sort of ties together what we've been talking about is, how can we move this week's anguish to participating in the vote rather than abandoning it because you don't trust the way the government might operate? A very good question from Tom Griggs. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom. And yes, pull the lever is something I think we'll keep saying. You had that as one of your other comments. We'll keep saying, even though it's not done. In New York, we have these big paper receipts that we slide in. I think that already organizations like Color of Change and Campaign Zero and even the Obama Foundation have quickly tried to give people channels to move the protest energy, to keep it going in the streets, but also to give it some levers for change and for policy change and some policy demands. And I think that's really important. And I think right now, the movement for Black Lives, the Black Lives Matter movement, is old now. It's sophisticated. We're not naive about what can change. We're not naive about the idea that only protest matters. I mean, none of this is actually, none of these sort of old false dualities between protest and politics or protest and policy, I think are ones that people, that I was marching with a couple of hours ago would buy. People really understand that the decisions that are made in the halls of power affect people's lives. And they really understand that they've got to speak up and to participate. And so I think that what we will need, though, is huge investments from nonprofit organizations, political parties, and everything in between on civic engagement and voter registration and integrated voter contacts. It's absolutely challenging because of social distancing and the pandemic, but it is really necessary for us to innovate. As Miles mentioned, I'm the co-chair of Color of Change, the largest online racial justice organization, which has a PAC, a political action committee that uses PAC money and able to help Black voters endorse candidates and work for candidates, primarily actually DAs and prosecutors, to make sure that we have criminal justice decisions that are commensurate with our values. There's a website called winningjustice.org where you can actually look up your prosecutor, because a lot of times you don't know who your DAs are, and that's winningjustice.org. I think it's really important that we recognize that it will take resources that are targeted to young people and to communities of color, to make sure that people, particularly at a moment when the joblessness rates are sky high, when we are at a Great Depression in the Black community, we are at Great Depression levels of unemployment for young adults. We need the resources that go into politics to be flowing to those communities in order to have people be able to feed themselves and also engage in politics. This is an all hands on deck moment.
Absolutely. And I think just to piggyback a little bit on that, is that we oftentimes put the onus of the voter to get up and dust off and go to the polls without the infrastructure necessary. As an example, in the Latinx community, we're going to be the second largest voting bloc for the very first time. But because we don't have a history of voting, because we're so young, oftentimes candidates don't contact us even if we are registered. In fact, in the last 2 election cycles, 49% of registered Latino voters did not receive a contact from a political party or from a candidate. 49%. And that is when organizations such as Voto Latino step in, and others, to talk to individuals of saying, not only is your vote important, but your vote matters. And we have to make sure that those are our resources. It's really interesting. We oftentimes talk about big dollars in elections, and we're talking about $2 to $3 billion, possibly just from the Democratic Party on this election. And we talk about those $3 to $2 billion to mobilize existing voters, when in fact the largest arbitrage opportunity is to invest $20 or $30 on a new voter, because the likelihood of a new voter going out to the polls is significantly higher than someone that may have already basically been tired of the process. At Voto Latino, 79% of the people we registered in the 2016 election went out and voted. In marginal elections, that's significant. So we want to make sure that people are continuing this conversation of making sure that there is those investments, because oftentimes people take for granted or expect either people of color to mobilize without information, or they already have this myth that young people don't vote, which was completely shattered in the 2018 election when young people outvoted their elders. And the expectation for the first time is that there will be 12 million more young voters in this election than baby boomers. They will technically be the largest voting bloc potential in our nation's history that we've ever seen. 2/3 of those young people are young people of color. We need to make sure that they are welcome to the process. Oftentimes, we hear young people say, or people trying to tell them that the system is rigged. And I often say that the system works as it should for the people who occupy it. And our job is to occupy the voting booth so that we see systemic changes. We talked today a little bit about the police brutality that we're facing. And we forget that Barack Obama actually created a 21st century policing task force. Voto Latino was part of it, with a half dozen organizations around the country, in partnership with business and in partnership with local governments and in partnership with the police force. And it gave a blueprint. And one of the resounding pieces of policy prescription that it provided was the need to change culture because of police brutality. This came about because of Ferguson, and we had a government that was responsive. The Trump administration zeroed out funding for that program. So it makes you wonder, had these police officers actually witnessed or been trained by the step, not saying that's the whole solution, but by the step, would George Floyd be alive today? Just like when President Obama basically provided a 40-page pandemic manual on how to avoid it. Had we actually implemented that, how many thousands of lives could we have saved in Americans today? Those are the questions we ask, because oftentimes we like to say that government is all the same, but when we actually have someone who cares about our government and our service and our people, there are solutions. They may not be overnight, but there are solutions that are provided to root out some of these systemic issues.
Yeah, Tom, I think that's a great question. I think it's really hard to be a responsible citizen these days. One reason for not participating in the vote, I don't know, a couple decades ago, was that you thought there wasn't much difference. What is really the difference between a Clinton and a Bush? I don't know. They feel awfully close together, but I don't think anybody really thinks that anymore, right? The differences are pretty stark. And one really heartening thing, I think some of the younger generation has a sophistication that my generation lacked about the vote. I think that especially the activists, right? Voting is like a thing. It's not going to solve all your problems. You still need to be out on the streets. You still need to form organizations. You still need to do all of this other stuff, but it's a thing. And it's not that hard. And so if you're interested in making change, do that thing and a bunch of other things. But if you don't even do that thing, then what are you talking about, right? And so I think enforcing that message that voting is a form of political engagement, but not the be-all, end-all. It's not going to achieve the change that you want to see or solve all of your problems, but it's one of many things that one should do as a citizen, a responsible citizen.
Right. Let me, one interesting thing that I think of this election, I think actually there will be, I agree with what Maria, Teresa, and Heather were saying. I think people are going to be very, very motivated to vote. I don't think it's going to be a matter of sort of dragging people out. But I think one of the things that's going to be really necessary is a lot of voter education on the process. Because I think what's going to happen is there are going to be lawsuits and litigation and arguments over the process. There are going to be different ways of doing mail-in voting. There are going to be different ways of signature matching. It's a very decentralized system. So I think one of the things that's going to happen is a lot of education about just how to do it.
Yep.
I think why to do it is important. The need to do it is important. But I actually think in this year, just how to do it, the mechanics are going to be a really important piece of public education that we need.
So
Miles, I think to address that point, we are, for the very first time, Voto Latino actually has created a C4 arm, and we're actually actively raising $4.5 million specifically on exactly what you're saying, because there's going to be a lot of misinformation, and the best way we actually tackle that misinformation is with the right information.
Great. Okay, I have one other question. I think an interesting piece of what is happening this year is a lot of people are looking at helping out in other states because they may feel like they're not in a battleground state, or they don't have a Senate race that they care about. But there are a lot of mechanisms that are being set up for people to kind of get involved in other states' elections. Do you have any thoughts about that? Is there any downside to that? And how would you advise somebody who wanted to help out in some Senate race of the state that they weren't part of?
Sure. Let me take to start. Two things. One, yes, more activity the better. Go knock on doors wherever you want. Just go, just do it. There's really not that many wrong ways to do it. you will have an impact. You will be changed by it. It's great. Two, and then there, lots of organizations there's a Adopt a State website that I'm blanking on right now. Sorry, but I can find it for you all.
Is that Swing Left? Is it Swing Left?
Oh, there's Swing Left. Yeah, there's Swing Left. Thank you. You could want to swing right too. I'm not suggesting that an entirely progressive audience, but two, there is an issue in your hometown and in your backyard that you are not attuned to, that you probably actually would care a lot about. So I just want to make sure that we're all thinking about both the big national races and your, school boards, your city councils, your secretaries of state, as Miles Rapoport was in Connecticut. Connecticut has, according to the Urban Institute, one of the country's highest racial disparity in juvenile justice. That's something that you could get very involved with at the local level if you wanted to see that disparity closed. Black youth are committed to facilities at 24 times the rate of their white peers. And then white youth are 75% more likely to go to a residential treatment center. There are all these issues that if you just spend some time learning about, you can become a super citizen activist on them. And it's not just about who has the gavel in Washington. It's about how your neighbors' lives are. And you can really actually do a lot of good on an issue that there aren't that many people working on.
Great. All right. I want to segue to our third question because we're getting, we're not close to the end yet, but we've got about 20 minutes left. And I want to make sure that we challenge all of the three of you to kind of look ahead and dream and vision a little bit. So here's the question. Looking ahead to 2030, 10 years from now, what is the democracy you most hope we will have, and what are the most important things we can do to achieve it? And I will start this round with asking Archon to vision us into the future. What is the agenda for the next decade?
Yeah, I think there are so many things, and we've touched on many of the electoral pieces and many of the inequality and anti-racist priorities here. I'll just add one to the mix that reinforces a little bit of what I said before. Democracy, again, is about equal power, equal opportunity for participation and influence. And as I said, I think the greatest source of political inequality right now is in the group structure. Who gets an organization to articulate their interests and organize them and advocate for them? There's lots of organizations, business associations, chambers of commerce, industry lobbies. I get organizations like the American Association of University Professors that organizes for me and advocates for policies that benefit me. But groups and organizations for people in the bottom 80% are far fewer and weaker. And so that's what I would like to see in 2030 is a much more robust, much more fair, much more inclusive structure of groups. So, it used to be labor unions. Labor unions are the folks who brought you the weekend. They used to be able to do a better job for workers, for some workers, but they're pretty weak today. I'd like to see workers get more organizations. I'd like to see parents, teachers, consumers, people of color, working people, women, immigrants, all should have powerful groups that represent their interests. And there's a lot of laws and policies that could facilitate this. A lot of state laws and some national laws over the last few decades have been kind of deunionization laws. We should kind of have reorganization laws that enable people to form organizations. One crazy idea. So I don't know how many people followed the Democratic primary debates about money and politics, but Andrew Yang, his solution was democracy dollars. So he thought every citizen should get $100 that they can give to any political candidate. And so that would equalize out a little bit the money and politics game, right? It's an interesting idea. And that made me think, well, what if everybody gets 100 or maybe 1,000 organizing dollars, and then different organizations, Heather's organization, María, Teresa's organization, Miles's organization could come to Archon and say, hey, I want your 500, 1,000 organizing dollars because I'll advocate for you. And then if you had that, 20 people could get together And they could hire a whole organizer, because organizers aren't paid very much, unfortunately. They should be paid better. But you could get a lot of political muscle if everybody in America had $500 that they could pool to get an organizer to help advocate for their interests and to get them organized. And organizations like Voto, Latino, and Demos and many others could vie for those dollars and get staff and be able to organize people for their interests wall to wall. And everybody in America would be organized, not just the top 10 or 20% of America.
All right. Maria Teresa, what do you think when you think about 2030?
Well, I would like to lean into the work that, Miles, that you and I have been working on with Archon, and that is universal voting. I think that having that as a policy position, but also implementation, would change a lot. We're right now living in a place where people do not want to battle for ideas. They've put our country, party over country. And when we actually debate ideas, that's when innovation happens. So that would be one of the immediate policy pieces I'd like to see. But I'd also like to see, coming out of COVID, I would like to see us have a real come to Jesus moment of what is the world that we need to excel in the 21st century. How do we expand opportunity so that my children who are 6 and 7 can walk into a room and actually compete on their merits and their ideas and equally? And we need to do that with a moment of will. Do we have the will to do that? You know, my children and Heather's children, and I assume your granddaughter, they technically represent the first majority minority country. They are a generation that is here. And are we building the systems and the leadership and the institutions where we are preparing them to take the reins of government and of power? And I would say right now we are not. So what do we need to do to ensure that they are living their best versions of themselves and striving for the 21st century? Oftentimes people say, well, you know, that it's too hard, but we did just exactly that 100 years ago when we were going through many similar transitions, whether it was economy, whether it was infusion of immigrants, whether it was making sure that we're coming out of a Great Depression, a Great War. The nation doubled down on itself and created nation building and decided that with the will, we were going to create a more robust middle class. Now, granted, not everyone of America got that equally, but it was a contract. What is our contract for the 21st century? And I would say that it has to be very much intertwined with addressing climate change. And I actually believe it's through the lens of climate change where we can modernize our infrastructure, get people back to work, and being very diligent of creating a more perfect union. But it has to be done with will. But those would be the two things. Not small at all, but absolutely within our wheelhouse and our potential.
That's great.
Okay, great. You know, before I go to Heather, I'm gonna throw in 2 points for myself, if I can. One is I do want to expand a little bit on what Maria Teresa was just saying, because I do think that one of the things, if I close my eyes and think about 2030, I would like to live in a country where absolutely everybody voted. And on the one hand, that involves making it possible for everyone to vote. But if you look at the country of Australia, since 1924, it has been an accepted civic duty that you have to vote. Just in the way in America, in the United States, it is an accepted civic duty that you have to serve on a jury if you are called. If we had 90% turnout in elections in this country, it would be a dramatically different situation. So this has been an idea that has been kind of completely off the table in terms of American politics, but Maria Teresa and Archon and EJ Dion and I have been working on a working group, and we're hoping to release a report sometime in the next month or two that will at least raise this question for more public discussion. So I'm excited about that. And I'll throw in one other thing on the youth. I do think that we now have 23 states where 16 and 17-year-olds can pre-register, but they can't vote till they're 18. I think when I think about what the amazing activism of young people in these days, that we could really consider lowering the voting age to 16. And I think that would have a transformational impact also on civic education and other things. So those are just two little Miles Rapoport thoughts as a lead into our last thinking about this, and that's from Heather McGhee. Heather?
Thank you, Miles. I like those wild ideas. We did a video with Demos and Move On called "What If Everybody Voted," which I think you can find online and on Facebook, which is a fun sort of thought experiment on that. So I think Maria Teresa, you sounded like I usually sound in conversations like this with all the ideas that I usually put out there. So I was like, yes, 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 and more yes. Total agreement. So let me try to do something that's maybe a little bit different. I did see some questions in the chat about sort of, specifically how do we deal with racial inequality, whether it's health disparities or the massive racial wealth gap that we have, which is really where history shows up in your wallet, the history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of redlining, of the predatory mortgage crisis, the 13-to-1 racial wealth gap, where a white family headed by someone who dropped out of high school has the same level of wealth as a Black family that has someone who went to college. This is not about individual thrift or effort or even earnings or income. This is simply about intergenerational wealth hanging on from a time when wealth building was explicitly racist. And so, on Monday of this week, on June 1st, members of the House, led by Barbara Lee, introduced a resolution calling for a U.S. Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. It is a process and a framework that was developed by the Kellogg Foundation by a woman named Gail Christopher, who happens to be my mother. But I independently think it's a wonderful idea. And so do 14 cities and states around the country and over 20 campuses that have adopted the framework to start their own processes, which involve creating new community histories and community visions for the future. If people want to check it out, it is really fascinating. And the idea of truth and reconciliation, they don't call it reconciliation because we don't need to be reconciled. We were never together to begin with, right? This country was founded on inequality, racial inequality and hierarchy. So we need to sort of transform instead of reconciling. But the Dallas, Texas, TRHT, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation has a lot online that you can look at. And it helps us imagine what it would be like to rewrite the narrative of our country, to get on the same page so that we can finally turn the page, so that we can recognize that we do, in fact, need to have a national apology for the atrocities that were made by the United States government to all of the different peoples in this country, but first, the first peoples whose labor and land was stolen. And we also need to deal with the fact that we are actually never going to be equitable if we don't have some system of reparations. And there is a new book out that I actually just downloaded that is from the University of North Carolina Press, called From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century by Kirsten Mullen and William Darity. It is really pragmatic. It just goes through and talks about all of the different ways it could possibly done, all of the sort of counter arguments. And, one of the things that I think has become very clear in both of the financial crises of the past, or both of the economic crises of the past 15 years, is that we can print money when we want. We can print money and give trillions of dollars out for free. And we usually just do that for people who are already wealthy and don't really need it. And we can actually do that to deal with childhood hunger today and to stave the Great Depression and transform our economy. And we can certainly do it to right the wrongs of this country's original sin.
All right, I'm for a 2030 where that has all taken place. That sounds great. I want to come back and there's a question that's here. We have a few more minutes, and then I'll come back and see if there are any concluding remarks that you want to make. But I think this is something that's on many people's minds. And the question is, how can we inoculate against the potential that Donald Trump will assert that the election was rigged should he lose, further undermining voter trust in the process? Heather, I think you talked earlier about really having people understand that this is going to take time to count the votes and, not to do that. But I think this is a broader question that people are asking. And I don't know if any of you have thoughts on it or would like to take a crack at it.
I would keep my answer short. I actually think that our job is to flood the zone and to flood the voting booth and to bring every single person that we know that's eligible registered, because it's harder to rig something when you have such high level of awareness and we have participation. And we're going to see in the next 5 months a lot of dissuasion, making it seem that it's hard, and real obstacles of thuggery in some cases. I will share with you in the 2018 election as an example in El Paso, they wanted to conduct ICE exercises just blocks away from a voting booth. And Voto Latino, along with the Texas Organizing Project, many others, issued trying to stop that, and we luckily did. But that is the type of intimidation that we have seen that he is willing to use for the government to do. So we just have to be diligent, but we have to make sure that there's more. I always say there's more of us who believe in our democracy than don't. And we have to make sure that we flood the zone, because it has to be a participation level that they've never seen, similar to what we saw in 2018. 123 million Americans sat it out in the last 2016 elections, saying that there wasn't going to be a difference. This is what we got.
Mine's pretty fanciful, but I really do think that the only real secure foundation to defend against claims like that is if most Americans really dig deep and say, it's the election. Having a free and fair election is so much more important than who wins it. And I just think we need to reach across to people who agree with us and people who don't agree with us and try to dig deep for that civic sentiment and commitment and small d democratic sentiment that in opinion polls, both Democrats and Republicans, support all of these small d democracy measures. It's the leadership that's the issue. And so in all of the conversations with your friends, people on social media or whatever, try to get people to dig deep beyond the partisanship to that more civic, fundamental, kind of constitutional sentiment that it's the election that matters.
It's interesting. I think in a little bit, the some of what we've heard in recent days, maybe surprisingly enough, is from the military, who are saying very explicitly that we need to make a commitment to saving our democracy, to protecting the Constitution. And implicitly, they are saying that those issues are so important, that they supersede the political directives that we may succeed. And I think people saying that and thinking that and understanding that this election has to, truly represent the people of the country, I think is a really important thing. Okay, any other, let me see if there are any questions over here. How concerned, all right, let's do, while we're on negative ideas, we have to end with positive idea. You all three are required to end with a positive idea. You know that, but
I think we're kind of wired that way, Miles. Right?
Okay, that's good. That's right. That's right. That's why I like
true.
I like but how concerned should we be about foreign interference? What are our thoughts here?
It's real. Aside from the task force that you and I participate in, I'm part of another one. It's called the Election Crisis Task Force. It was prescient in January, and it's basically it's 30 organizations, former Secretary of States, former members of Congress, judges, and industry. And one of the issues that we try to tackle is misinformation. I think that what we are hearing, even on how some of these demonstrations seemed less spontaneous, but more organized, or with bad actors. We know that the Russians did that in 2016. We have documented fact that they would create events under the banner of Black Lives Matter and then host something that was very that was white nationalist across the same town to gin up protest. And so we just have to be very mindful. And that's why trusted messengers, whether it's Color of Change, whether it's Demos, whether it's Voto Latino, that's where we become much more relevant because we are communicating with our audiences all the time. And we are those purveyors of the right information. And so we just need to make sure that we are diligent and providing people with the counter information that they can trust.
Any other comment on it?
Yeah, I think we know that it's here. We know what the foreign disinformation wants, and we actually know what their strategy is, which is to divide us. And they looked at our weak spots and they said, "Oh, yeah, you guys still haven't figured out this race thing," and that was the majority of the sort of narratives that they pushed in the 2016 election, and we've seen it again. There's been a lot of glee around this wound reopening, and so this is an issue of national security. We have got to have racial justice and equality, or we will always be vulnerable to attack.
Yeah, I wonder. I think I haven't heard this response so much. I mean, I of course completely agree that the threat is real, and it was in 2016, and I don't see any reason that it would really abate. People are election officials, others are a little bit better prepared for it, but it might be an opportunity, right? I mean, what believing in American democracy means is that we get to rule ourselves. Other people don't get to mess around with that. And it is an insult, right? The foreign interference should be an insult no matter what your policy or political beliefs are. And that should be a deep source of unity and motivation to rule ourselves as Americans. And we should be, offended across party lines that happens. And we should build on that kind of strength that what our democracy is about is ruling ourselves together, wherever that ends up.
And I think a point you made earlier, Archon, which is that there's a lot more agreement among citizens and people around that than there is at the top levels of the political partisan leadership. All right, we're just about out of time, but I want to give all three of you a chance to say anything that you're thinking. Otherwise, I will thank you very much. But I'll say something personal. My mother was an English teacher, and she loved to go to parties, and she loved to talk with people. And my father always just wanted to go home. So we would know that it was time, because he would go up to her at some point in an event and say, "Florence, make your concluding remarks." So, Archon, Maria, Teresa, Heather, make your concluding remarks.
My concluding remarks is just action folks can take. I do think the Obama Foundation put together a great list of resources on obama.org. Hi, Jana. And also Color of Change. You can text 55156. You can text to 55156, demands Floyd join, pretty much anything, and you will get hooked in with Color of Change. Thank you.
I think that very similarly, if someone mentioned that what they could do because they wanted to register voters, and we are actually setting up a program. So if folks send text volunteer to the same number, volunteer to 73179, we will actually provide you with all the toolkits that you need to register voters and to also text voters on voter information. Since COVID, we have texted over 175,000 Americans to make sure that they have the right information for their and get them prepared for their primaries. So the work hasn't stopped. We are a digital first organization, digital natives, and the idea is to make sure that we are constantly flooding the zone with information. And so if you guys want to join us, volunteer at 73179. And Miles, thank you so much for this conversation. It's nice to be a community after a couple of tough days. So thank you.
Yeah, and thanks. Just thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Miles, for organizing such a wonderful discussion. And, these are the most challenging times for democracy in my lifetime, and everybody, participating in this event, you wouldn't be spending your Thursday evening doing this if you didn't really, really care about democracy. So just keep acting on it in every possible way by learning and thinking about it as you are tonight, by following the calls for action that Heather and Maria Teresa put out, and certainly by voting, but not only by voting, so many other things to be done in the days ahead.
All right. Listen, thank you, all three of you. This is great. Thanks to the audience. And I think there's a last announcement from Liz Nearing.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I am so inspired by all of you and just floored that I get to share the screen with you. So thank you. I just want to shout out that we have a survey. If you don't mind, it's real quick, just artidea.org/survey. It helps us know what you're getting out of this and what you want. So I would love to hear from you. We are going to be back tomorrow with another Ideas event. You can check out all of them at artidea.org. Thank you so much and have a wonderful night.